Chapter 6. Krishna. In the Bhagavad-Gita, there is nothing that is closer to the teachings of the Christ in any language than, "Cling thou to me. Clasp me with heart and mind. So shalt thou dwell surely with me on high. But if thy thought droops from such height, if thou best weak to set body and soul upon me constantly, despair not. Give me lower service. Seek to read me, worshipping with steadfast will. And if thou canst not worship steadfastly, work for me, toil in works pleasing to me. For he that laboreth right for love of me shall finally attain. But, if in this thy faint heart fails, bring me thy failure. Find refuge in me. Let fruits of labor go. Renouncing all for me, with lowliest heart, so shalt thou come. For, though to know is more than diligence, yet worship better is than knowing, and renouncing better still. Near to renunciation, very near, dwelleth eternal peace. Take my last word, most utmost meaning have. Give me thy heart. Adore me. Serve me. Cling, in faith and love and reverence to me. So shalt thou come to me. I promise true. Make me thy single refuge. I will free thy soul from all its sins. Be of good cheer. There were very likely two Krishnas, each an incarnation of Jesus. The ancient legends of India speak of the early period when the Vedas, the oldest books of religious literature, came into being. Krishna is believed to be one of the projections of Vishnu, one of the trinity of great Hindu gods. Over the centuries, there would seem to have been a number of invasions of India. Apparently, the mission of the first Krishna would have been the restoration, from memory, of these early teachings which may have been forgotten or lost after such an invasion. Historically, we know that a group of Aryans swept into India about the middle of the second millennium BC, according to John B. Noss, author of Men's Religions. These people would have been of many backgrounds, but some would have been cousins of the Iranians or Persians. According to Noss, the Aryan group were tall, light-skinned, and for a long time they had been moving eastward looking for a permanent home. These people were of the same ethnic group which brought into being the historic Greeks, Latins, Celts, Germans, and Slavs. He writes, "Time was to see great changes in language habits and ideas among both the Iranians, the early Persians, and Indo-Aryans. But the original similarities, both in language and in religion, can be traced without difficulty. The Indo-Aryans settled first on the upper branches of the Indus River. They had been a nomadic people, but now they began to live in simple village groups among the flocks and herds. As they fought their way southeastward along the base of the Himalaya mountains and began to adjust to the new climate, their life became less pastoral and more agricultural in character." In a reading given to an individual by Edgar Cayce, he says, "In a previous sojourn in India, this entity was among those who persecuted the people who came down from the hill country for the fruits of the valleys. As a leader of the raiders, he took not only the spoils, but he also put into servitude those who fell into his hands. Under the name of Abhiajul, he lost in soul development through persecuting his fellow man. As a result, he now has almost a hatred for one who would persecute another." Apparently, this man to whom Edgar Cayce gave the reading must have met persecution and servitude in a subsequent incarnation, even as he had persecuted others in his sojourn in India. John Noss credits this later invaders with much of the poetic symbology and creative imagination of East Indian literature to these later invaders, and there is no doubt that these people added much, but the original Vedas were the basis of all the religious writings that followed. In the beginning, the men of that period would have herded their cattle, waged warfare whenever they deemed it necessary, while the women carried on the gardening and homemaking. The animals which they brought into India with those were cows, horses, sheep, goats and dogs. The Zoroastrians used a type of plant in their religious ceremonies, and these settlers also drank what they called soma, which they believed gave them visions and dreams. These invaders adopted this ancient custom begun centuries before. John B. Noss goes on to say that a king or chieftain, called a Raja, ruled over the people, And this kingship was hereditary. A great many warriors were needed to maintain the Raja's army, but far outnumbering these were the priests who served the ruler and his people. In the early days, the father in each family acted as priest. The wife and mother in early India was a far more independent individual than her present-day counterpart. She knew little of restraint and acted as a helpmeet to her husband, and to her was delegated the management of the family. Thus, it was from a rather independent people that the folk tales and stories of India took shape. In no other country, except, perhaps, Atlantis, has the idea of a twin soul grown up as much as India. The god usually has a counterpart or an alter ego, and she continues with him in many lifetimes. It is believed in most Indian cults that all men have one with whom they have been, eternally. An integral portion of their own spirit, or what Edgar Cayce, as well as Plato, referred to as the twin soul. Perhaps, this belief is because the woman assumed such an equal role in early India with their husbands. Only from a happy people would such an ideal have held prevalent for centuries. With the second Krishna, Radha is believed to have been his twin soul, as Rama, another incarnation, Sita was the other part of his being. To return to Nos. These invaders had hardly won a place for themselves in India before they began to develop an extensive oral tradition. Folk tales and epic stories took shape rapidly at the same time. The hymns and prayers of their priests gave voice to their religious conceptions. Out of these last, together with ancient magic runes and spells, have come Hinduism's earliest sacred writings, four in number: the Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajur Veda and Atharva Veda. Veda means knowledge. The Rig Veda, literally, the Veda of stanzas of praise, is an anthology of religious poetry in 10 books, containing over 1,000 hymns, and representing creative efforts of many generations. It was not reduced to writing until about the 8th century BC. Before that it existed in oral form. As the early temples came into being, there were still invasions from foreign people. In a reading for a girl called Inil, a priestess in the early temple, Edgar Cayce describes the invasion and desecration and destruction of these temples. Many of the priests who had committed the Vedas to memory either were killed or died from hunger. Inil was said by Edgar Cayce to have gained in soul development because she attempted to succor and comfort those of the people who had become insane through grief and persecution. Because the Vedas were committed to memory, many of them may have been lost. There is a symbolic story of great Vishnu, one of the trinity of gods of whom the priests of India believe Krishna to have been a projection. It is said that the heart of Vishnu became greatly grieved because the Vedas had been lost. Even those which were placed upon early scrolls had been thrown into the depths of the sea. Whenever injustice has prevailed, Vishnu returns in mortal form. I come down to earth and take human shape. But how could the Vedas be returned from the sea? It was necessary for Vishnu to assume the role of a fish, and as a fish, he went into the very depths and retrieved the Vedas which had been lost, and brought them up with his mouth. This symbolic story tells of that which is written in the Akasha. Many of the Vedas had been forgotten, but one who had all knowledge within his own heart chose to incarnate, not as a fish, which was later the symbol for Christianity, but as a man. As scribe. From the depths of his spirit, symbolic of the sea, he brought forth, once again, that which was lost. That which had long been forgotten. The Vedas. And this one was the first Krishna, as scribe and a priest. Of the first Krishna, we know little of his lifetime, except that it would have been spent in meditation, in the halls of memory. He would have been a scribe priest who would have restored the Rig Veda to his people. Centuries later, the first teacher of righteousness was to precede Jesus of Nazareth by several centuries. That which was begun in the Essenian order, as the teacher of righteousness, was completed in the lifetime of Jesus. Thus, the first Krishna, working silently, in humble places, restored the foundations of the religious belief that was necessary for the people of India. He, too, made way for that one who was to follow him. Krishna of the Bhagavad-Gita, or the second Krishna. Krishna of the Bhagavad-Gita. In the book Young India, 1925, Mahatma Gandhi says of the Bhagavad-Gita, where Krishna is depicted as a savior, "I find a solace in the Bhagavad-Gita that I miss even in the Sermon on the Mount. When disappointment stares me in the face, and all alone I see not one ray of light, I go back to the Bhagavad-Gita. I find a verse here and a verse there, and I immediately begin to smile in the midst of overwhelming tragedies, and my life has been full of external tragedies, and if they have left no visible, no indelible scar on me, I owe it all to the teachings of the Bhagavad-Gita." In planning this book, which I meant to be merely the high points of the lives of Jesus, I did not include either of the Krishnas. Edgar Cayce had not chosen to pinpoint them, although in an exchange of readings between him and Eileen Garrett, the famous medium, years before his death, he was told by her guide that in this incarnation, he had shut off several lifetimes in India. Whether this is true or not, the very purpose of Edgar Cayce seemed to be to bring back to those of the Western world the knowledge of reincarnation put into understandable form, so that each man might understand and know the reason for the happenings within his own life. And, equally true, to bring to men a deeper realization of the truth of the Old and New Testament. Hundreds of people, after reading of Edgar Cayce, have turned back to the scriptures. Perhaps, this is why he may have chosen to emphasize the biblical teachings rather than those of the East. 2. We have several teachers who are most cognizant of the Eastern teachings. The outstanding one, perhaps, is Manly Hall, whose life and writings are dedicated to this purpose. As I pondered for several weeks as to how to distinguish between the deep symbology of the Indian legends relating to Vishnu and Krishna, it seemed almost impossible to do so. There is, perhaps, no country in the world where imagination has reached such heights. And again, we must ask, is it just imagination? In many of the early stories of India we find references to chariots which fly in the air. A civilization which existed centuries and centuries ago. Are these merely symbology, or are they not memories within the collective unconscious of a civilization such as Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, La, Da, Ur? As a people, they lived by dreams for centuries. As the followers of Zoroaster drank of the Haoma plant, the soma became a part of the religious ceremonies in early Hinduism. Perhaps, some of the visions of these people resulted from this practice. And out of these glimpses of another world, the eternal legends sprang up, told in many fashions, but containing the heart of truth within each. The very fairy tale quality of the ancient symbology is difficult for the much more practical Western mind to understand. For all of these reasons, it seemed best not to include Krishna, either the compiler of the Vedas or the Krishna of the Bhagavad-Gita. In the first week of writing the book I knew that it could not be a mere 20 pages. I was caught up, fascinated, with the parallels in the lives of Jesus. It has always been my custom to write, without editing, to the typewriter, and to finish a booklet in 20 or 30 hours. I could not do this with this book. It was as if, in a sense, it was already written. And I had to wait to hear that which should come next. However, I was determined not to include Krishna. This I would not do. Already, the friends closest to me were extremely upset that I should even consider, despite the readings of Edgar Cayce, that Jesus had many lifetimes. At least 30, to write of reincarnation patterns of Jesus. It would be far better not to mention Krishna. One night at the library where I was studying the writings of Enoch, I felt a strange stillness within me. It was as if the busy Los Angeles street outside had become very quiet. But it was more than silence without. It was a silence within. Leaving my pen, my notebooks, my purse on the library table, I walked over to the back section of the room. Reached out and took down a book. It was not the Bhagavad-Gita, but Young India, and I opened it, without thinking, and found the quotation on a Gita from Mahatma Gandhi. As I read it, as this stillness left me. It was chance. It was coincidence. Similar incidents have happened before in my life, but never accompanied by such an inner quiet, as if time, itself, had stopped. That night I tried to put the incident out of my mind. But the strangeness, the stillness, the sense of being guided across that huge room filled with people. And the utter silence. I could not forget it. At the moment of drifting into sleep, a dream began. It was the same dream, or a continuance of it, that I had had years ago. Once again I was back in a temple-like structure. I walked through corridor after corridor, room after room. I remembered in the second dream that I had been here before, and that I had found the quotation, "Thou art of the order of Melchizedek, forever." Was I to find it again? In this experience, this place was as familiar to me as my home. I knew that I was going to the same small room where I had gone, almost 10 years before. Finally, I was there. I opened the door and stood in the dim light. 2 scrolls, about 6 feet high in front of me. As I watched, they seemed to become very bright. Almost as a blind person, I went to them, and with my hands, felt the words. Written on the scroll on the left were the words from the Bhagavad-Gita. The scroll on the right contained the Sermon on the Mount. The essence was the same. The soul quality was the same. I knew beyond a shadow of a possible doubt that Krishna and the one called Jesus were the same soul. It was as if all knowledge was within the walls of that room. He had not come, just once, to a few people. He had come, many times, to all people. And in a way that each culture could understand. These different embodiments were for the purpose of reaching all in the earth. With this realization I was suddenly awake. I knew, then, that I must include Krishna. The moment in the library had not been by chance. This dream was a sequence to the dream that I had had before of Melchizedek. The words of the Gita that I read, I had memorized years ago, but never had their meaning been so clear. Never the spirit was born. The spirit shall cease to be, never. Birthless and deathless and changeless. Remaineth the spirit forever. The Young Krishna. The legends of the Young Krishna have fired the hearts of the people of India as no other stories in their history. Krishna, of the Bhagavad-Gita, is easily the most beloved person who has ever lived in their culture. His name is constantly upon their lips, from the simplest peasant to a Mahatma Gandhi. Again, many of the tales of him have arisen from a need within their own hearts. A need for a young God, with something of human faults and foibles, offset by the great love of for all mankind within him. In writing of him, the young Krishna, a modern poet, has captured his unquenchable spirit in the words. Rain falls and ceases, all the forest trembles. Mystery walks the woods once more. We hear a flute. It moves on earth, it is the God who plays, with the flute to his lips, and music in his breath. The God is Krishna, in his lovely youth. Such ever else sit well from canons of giant art. We remember that Jesus had been a musician, as a salve before him. This young Krishna became the most romantic figure of all the great ones to those of India. Except for the scriptures of the Zen Avesta, no other ancient writings afford women the same high place of those of the Vedas. The Zen Avesta tends to give women absolute equality with the man. A description of a wife given in the Mahabharata is evidence of the devotion and honor in which a woman was once held in this land of India. A wife is half the man, his truest friend. A loving wife is a perpetual spring of virtue, pleasure, wealth. A faithful wife is his best aid in seeking heavenly bliss. A sweet-speaking wife is a companion in solitude, a father in advice, a mother in all seasons of distress, a rest in passing through life's wilderness. A rest in passing through life's wilderness. There is the ancient story of the beautiful Savitri and her devotion to her beloved, Satyavan. In life, they shared all things. In death, he was separated from her, but she would not be satisfied. She followed his spirit into the world of death, and with fearless devotion, pleaded with the king of the dead to return him to the land of the living. So great was her prayer, that Satyavan was returned to her, for he was not just a husband of her body, but the husband of her spirit. Faithfulness and loyalty. These are a part of the early Indian tradition. Because reincarnation and karma are an integral part of their culture, one who is disloyal or unfaithful could create a karmic pattern, which would have to be worked out even in lifetimes later. Many years ago, I knew a geologist who was also a writer. He came of an old and distinguished family. A family whose forebears had founded a large university in America. Bert did not accept the idea of reincarnation, although his mother had been associated with the early theosophical groups under Catherine Tingley. When I first knew him, he was a man in his mid-50s, and although he had wealth and more than a degree of fame, he was exceptionally bitter. His life had been a strange one and a lonely one. After an early, unhappy marriage which ended in divorce, he met a woman who for 30 years was to mean everything to him. They had the same ideals, the same purposes, in the earth. As once Edgar Cayce gave the Jacob and Rachel, David and Jonathan had had the same sole purpose since the beginning. Bert met Harriet, also geologist, writer, archaeologist, halfway around the world. It was actually in India where they first met. A friendship sprang up that early summer. She was somewhat cool, somewhat contained, somewhat reticent. And it was not until he proposed marriage that she told him that she was married to a man many years her senior. Under no circumstances would she divorce her husband. For 30 years this friendship continued, in strange and out-of-the-way places in the world. They would see each other a few weeks each year, as their work was similar, and there would be constant letters between them. Harriet accepted the situation. She was grateful even for friendship, but Bert became more and more bitter. When Harriet died, suddenly, of a heart attack, and when he knew that his life would never know complete emotional fulfillment, he seemed very near to the breaking point. Then, one night he had a dream, the most vivid dream of his life. Bert dreamed he found himself in India. It was, perhaps, close to a century ago. He was an American, and his wealthy family had given him a trip to India upon his graduation from college. In India, he met a beautiful, unmarried woman called Rukmini. Since he was financially independent, he chose to marry her and to reside in India. 2 children were born to them, a boy and a girl, and the family was a closely knit one. Day after day, he was grateful for the good fortune that had brought such a wife to him, a wife who seemed to be a part of him, in all ways. Companion, friend, lover, child, mother. He said that the dream was so vivid that its reality was greater than anything that had to happen in this life. In the dream, however, he received a communication from his brother, in America, begging him to return to the New England states immediately, that the family wished to found a school, and his help would be needed. The letter stated that the family was aware of his alliance in India with this woman. Under no circumstances was he to bring her to America. Either he would return to the States, or he would no longer be a part of the family. In the dream, he was torn between the love for his wife and the fear of being expelled by his family. Apparently, they had just learned of his marriage. He had ample funds at the moment, but his income would be cut off, eventually, if he did not return to the States. Finally, a decision was made. He would leave. He would leave everything he owned with his wife in a strongbox to which she had the key. It would be enough to provide for her and the children until he could come back. Because, certainly, someday he would return. He could not bear to tell her goodbye, so after he had packed his things, secretly, after he had made arrangements for his passage, he slipped away, silently, into the night. Without a word to Rukmini. In the dream, he saw himself attaining recognition for writing, for teaching, for the founding of the school which was to become one of the greatest universities in America. He saw himself growing older, always meaning to return to India, but finally making another marriage which brought him nothing of love or fulfillment, but which did bring him great prestige. 2 other children were born of that union, and little by little he forgot Rukmini. He saw himself an old man, dying, very much alone. And in that moment of death, he saw the face of Rukmini. She came toward him, smiling, lovingly, her arms outstretched. But was it the face of Rukmini? The smile, the expression in the eyes, the way of moving. Who was this? What was so familiar about her? At that moment, he was awake. And he knew. The wife whom he had deserted a century ago, in India. The wife who had been called Rukmini. Was none other than Harriet. Harriet, whom he had loved for more than a quarter of a century, and from whom he was ever separated because of her obligations to another. Had he not left her, and formed other obligations? Had he not, even forgotten her? Had he not put aside loyalty to the one who meant everything to him? Perhaps, then, this life was what was called karmic. Perhaps, in this lifetime, he had been separated from Harriet by circumstances so that he could learn never again to put aside loyalty to one whom he loved. For Bert, it was an answer. It was not the answer he wanted, but it was an answer. An answer to a life of frustration. In the legends of the past lives of Krishna, most of which are symbolic, there is one which is similar to that of Bert. It could be that it was here, when he, who was to become Krishna, put aside a love that he began the karmic pattern which brought to him so much suffering as Jeshua, the Persian scribe. Perhaps, the story of Rama and Sita is allegory, as much of the East Indian literature is allegorical. It is, again, a story of the love of the alter ego, but in this instance, according to the legend, the twin soul was put aside. As with all the Indian legends, one is born of another. Sita was said to have been found in a furrow of earth by her father, Janaka. It was the time of the sacrificial rites, thus she was believed to be a holy child, one sent from the god, Vishnu. In the Vedas, Sita presides over agriculture. According to the Ramayana, Sita was the incarnation of the goddess, Lakshmi. Lakshmi is none other than the goddess of good fortune and beauty. Lakshmi is portrayed as a delicate and beautiful woman, holding the lotus flower in her hand. Other names for Lakshmi are Lokamata, the world mother, Jalandhija, ocean-born, or that born of spirit, Padma, meaning the symbol of the lotus. In the earth incarnation as Sita, it is said that she took embodiment for the purpose of the destruction of evil forces, of which the demon king Ravana was the symbol. When Sita had attained to the age of marriage, her father, Janaka, offered her to the strongest of the warriors. The one who could most successfully bend the great bow possessed by her father. It was Rama, the great god who had entered from another land, who chose to bend the bow. Thus, Sita, of all the women in her country, became his wife. It may be well to digress for a moment from the tragic love story of Rama and Sita to study the most ancient legends of Ram. Ram came to be called Rama by the soft-spoken people of this portion of the world which he chose to enter, but Rama and Ram are synonymous. Ram, the Atlantean. The legends of India indicate that Ram came from a far land. Many writers have designated Scythia as his homeland. Other interpreters have insisted that Rama was a native-born Indian. In the Edgar Cayce readings, he does not state that Ram was a former incarnation of Jesus. Krishna believed that he had been Ram or Rama who preceded both Krishnas, and who was the one who brought the first Vedas into being, as he was the one who brought astrological lore into India. Actually, India had many names at the time of the first invasion by the Atlanteans under the leadership of Ram. The time period precedes that given by John Knox and man's religions by thousands of years. In the Edgar Cayce file, there is a distinctive reference to Ram, as following Amelius. The first incarnation of Jesus. The reading gives. In the period of Atlantis, then, some 98,000 years before the entry of Ram into India, there lived in this land of Atlantis one Amelius. There is the suggestion here that Amelius and Ram are the same entity. One of the past lives of Krishna, according to the ancient writings, is that of Ram, pronounced Ram, as with Ra. It is difficult to distinguish exactly what time period Edgar Cayce is referring to here, as first he gives, some 100, apparently a pause. Some 98,000 years before the entry of Ram into India. Atlantis existed for about 200,000 years. If Edgar Cayce meant 198,000 years, then Ram would have entered India about 2,000 years before Hermes, the Nubian, a later incarnation of Jesus, entered Egypt with Ra-Ta. If Edgar Cayce meant 98,000 years, then there would have been a great time period between Ram and Hermes. Time is the most difficult factor in reading the Akasha. The answer is a simple one. In fourth-dimensional experiences, time does not exist. All time is one. The East Indian civilization is far older than that of Egypt, and it may be that the 98,000 years after Amelius is correct. The Ramayana, Life of Rama, usually pronounced Ramayana or Ramayana, is one of the greatest poetical works in the literature of India. The best-known translation was by India's great poet Valmiki, who is said to have seen two doves together. At that moment, some hunter shot an arrow into the breast of the female, and her mate cried out as if the arrow had struck his own heart. Valmiki, seeing the agony, cried out, "For endless years to come, O hunter, never shall thy soul find peace. Since for love itself, thou wouldest not formed from thy cruel slaying cease." It was after this experience that he began to write the great love story as handed down for generations upon generations. A more recent translation is that of Mahatma Gandhi's close friend Rajagopalachari, which was published only in 1968. In both of these references there is the story of flying chariots, and that Rama was of the solar dynasty. The dynasty of the sun. They place his beginnings in India, but it would seem that, as Edgar Cayce gave, Ram entered India, and that his birthplace was the island of Arion, a portion of Atlantis. This would have lain in the waters near that which is now Venezuela, whose soil is still red, and which did not sink with the rest of the Atlantean continent. We must remember that it was Ram who brought the first signs of the zodiac into India, and he, himself, was known as the Ram or Aryan. Since he was also from the island of Arion, the two names have probably been fused. As we are now approaching the age of Aquarius, leaving the age of Pisces, so Ram ushered in, as an individual, the age of Aries, after the darker cycle of Taurus, the bull. In the writings of many of the earlier Theosophists, we find great stress upon the fact that they say that Ram was Aryan. Of the Aryan culture. They are relating this to the name of a people inhabiting the Punjab and Iranian plateau, of which the languages include Celtic, Teutonic, Italic, Hellenic, etc. If Ram came from the island of Arion, in the last age of Atlantis, this very name may have been one by which he was called. Ram the Aryan, or Ram, the Aryan. When we return to the days of Atlantis, it is almost as if we are speaking of a fairy tale civilization. They were far more advanced than we are, presently. Television graced complete walls of their homes. Aerial flight was at its height. Individuals also were able to soar above the trees by the use of solar energy, which propelled them through the use of a solar belt. Sometimes, when we dream of flying just above the treetops, it may be a memory of Atlantis, or it may be an out-of-the-body experience. The spiritual awareness in Atlantis was far greater than our own. We are at a very beginning of a new age, and the children of the new age should know themselves as such by 1998. See Book 3, World Prophecy. There were two factions in Atlantis, those called the Sons of Belial, who were turning away from spiritual memory and becoming more and more scientific with less and less regard for the welfare of their fellow men. And the Sons of the Law of One, which cherished such beliefs as reincarnation, life after death. Again, there were few of this latter group who did not have some memory of their past embodiments. Sanskrit, which may have been introduced into India by Ram, is believed to be very close to Atlantean script. In the early 19th century, Great Britain sent a group of Welshmen into India who knew and spoke Gaelic. This group of soldiers were amazed to find that they could understand Sanskrit. Wales is believed to have been a portion of Atlantis, and Gaelic a derivative of Atlantean speech. It is interesting also that of all the forms of astrology, that the East Indian gives great detail of how to discover past lives through the birth date. Manly Palmer Hall has suggested how this may have been done, and within the last few weeks, the well-known Hollywood astrologer and mystic, Ralph Sterling, has regressed the chart of a woman, now living, to a lifetime as a famous actress when she was born in 1650. This has also been done with the same woman's chart in her most recent life experience as an English writer. This very wisdom, this very memory, would have been a part of the astrological lore brought into India, which was then known by many names. In the last age of Atlantis, almost a century ago, Faber de Olivet interpreted the astrological symbols in relationship to the life story of Ram. We quote, "The ram, fleeing with its head turned backwards, indicates Rama, when leaving his fatherland. Atlantis, sign of Aries, the bull, opposing his progress, but he falls on his knees. Sign of Taurus. The heavenly twins indicate the alliance made by Rama and his new people. Sign of Gemini. The crab, Ram's deep meditation and self-examination. Sign of Cancer. The lion, Ram's battles against his enemies. Sign of Leo. The winged virgin, spiritual victory. Sign of Virgo. The scales, equality between victors. Also, the sign of karmic justice. Sign of Libra. The scorpion, revolt and treason. Also, the knowledge of the highest of all mysteries and an awareness of the earth. Sign of Scorpio. The archer, symbolic of his personal revenge against the Shaitan force of Ravana, the evil demon. Sign of Sagittarius. The he-goat, symbolic of the long climb to the top of the mountain. Sign of Capricorn. The water-bearer, bringer of spiritual truths. Sign of Aquarius. The fish, the Christ consciousness. Sign of Pisces. Faber-Dahlewitz seems to indicate that in his latter years, when his whole life was turned to mysticism, Ram named the very signs of the zodiac as relating to his own trials and tribulations in that earth experience and to his final overcoming. However this may be, Ram either originated the 12 astrological signs or would seem to have brought this knowledge from Atlantis. Perhaps, Ram was almost a forerunner of his embodiment as Joshua. Joshua was to lead his people, with Moses, out of the land of Egypt where they were enslaved. Ram was to enter India with a great host of followers, because he knew that the time was approaching when, one day, Atlantis would go into the sea for the third and last time. He wished to establish the spiritual mysteries with these people. It would be within the soul memory of their country, so that all of the great Atlantean memory house of records would not be lost to future civilizations. In researching the astrological period with Ralph Sterling, the astrologer, he mentioned the lag and lead, plus or minus 3 degrees 56 minutes, of the variable equinox with respect to the steady poles. This seems borne out by the findings of Edgar Cayce. He also relates, at great length, that the fact that the equinox still continues to fall in 0-degree Aries indicates that at some time since the beginning of the Christian era, the fixed zodiac of constellations was abandoned, and the names reapplied to a moving zodiac based upon the equinoctial point, then recognized as the beginning of the astrological year. The year's arc of precession was thus ignored, an annual loss of a moment of time that shows up in no calculation at present in use, other than in the consideration of the precession of the equinoctial point and the 1-degree revision of star positions every 70 years. Can it be that our only record of one of these early, astrological, adjustments of the calendar is that of Joshua having commanded the sun to stand still? To my knowledge, Ralph Sterling is the only astrologer who has considered this possibility. Because astrology was so much a part of the life of Ram, the Zoroastrians were familiar with his life. In the second writings of Zoroaster, in that called the Zend-Avesta, we find the reference to Ram, who was known as Yima by the Persians. Zarathustra, Zoroaster, asked of Ahura Mazda, the god of light. Ahura Mazda, holy and sacred creator of all earthly beings, exceeding pure. Who was the first man with whom thou didst hold converse? Thou art Ahura Mazda. Then Ahura Mazda replied, with beautiful Yima, who was at the head of a company worthy of all praise. And I said to him, watch over the worlds that are mine. Make them fertile in thy great capacity as protector, and I brought the arms of victory. I, who am Ahura Mazda. To him I gave a lance and a spear of gold. Then Yima rose to the stars in the south on a path of the sun. He proceeded over the earth which he made fertile. And the shining Yima assembled the most virtuous men in the famous Aryanavia, pure created. Vendidit Sade, second Fargard. Since Zoroaster, son of Zend, was reading the Akashic records at this point, it may have been that he recognized Yima, or Ram, as an incarnation of Amilius, who was the androgynous being who chose to separate into the male and female polarities. It would be interesting to know if Zoroaster recognized Yima, Ram and Amilius as his earth father in Persia, Zend. This may have been true, since Zoroaster chose to call his great treasure house of scriptures the Zend-Avesta, the eternal wisdom of the ages. There has been great effort on a part of many writers to establish the Ram was of the white race. If he were an Atlantean, he was, definitely, of the red race, of which the American Indian is a modern-day descendant. If, in a day to come, nothing is to be remembered of the readings of Edgar Cayce except that all races were created simultaneously, this will be that which no other interpreter of the eternal records has chosen to give. Man moves in and out of racial patterns. If he persecutes those of another race, he must enter that race, karmically. All races are the same in the sight of God. Another prophecy, as given, is that unless man recognizes all men as brothers, civilization will move westward, and the Orient may foster the next outstanding race of men. Centuries and centuries hence, but it is a part of the future unless all men become brothers. In entering the great land which would someday be known as India, then, Ram brought the red strain into their blood. The Caucasian was to come centuries later. It may have been that pride was the great weakness of the Atlantean. Pride of color, pride of race. The Dravidians, who were dark of skin, would seem to have been the early inhabitants of India, and they, too, had reached a very high point in civilization. India and Egypt, after Atlantis, were the two great mothers of religion, but India came first by many centuries. Valmiki, the great Hindu poet, writing of Rama thousands of years later, was to say, "He was the Lord of the world, the master of its soul and the love of men. He was both father and mother to his subjects. He bound all beings with the chain of love. He bound all beings with the chain of love." This was his mission in every age, in every embodiment. For all are offspring of him. Closer than hands or feet. He was to bring into India the religion of Atlantis, the worship, in the beginning, of the one God. But the one God of the Atlanteans was the eternal masculine and the eternal feminine in principle. There was no inequality of sex in Atlantis. In early India, women shared equally with men. The ideal of spiritual marriage prevailed in Indian literature from the time of Ram, who had brought with him this principle from his own Isle of Aryan. Even in the story of Rama and Sita. Sita, the girl of India who Rama believed to be the other portion of his entity, his twin soul we find, in the words of Rajagopalachari. Sita, pronounced Sita, is the female counterpart of the Supreme Being, Rama. She is the embodiment of compassion and grace. Compassion is the Supreme Mother, and she is enthroned in the heart of the Lord. God as Father and God as Mother are not distinct. The quality of the Lord's compassion can be understood from the experience of true human love. In the Rama Avatar, Rama did not know that he was God, incarnate. Krishna knew that he was an avatar, as did the Christ. Krishna, of course, was to remember that he had been Ram or Rama. There was never a moment in the latter days of the second Krishna that he was not aware that he had come into the body as an avatar of his people. There was never a moment in the lifetime of Jesus that he was not aware that he had come as an avatar for all the people of the earth. The story of Ram of the Isle of Aryan, then, was one of the great mystic who felt impelled to take the sacred teaching of Atlantis into another land. In the Ramayana is the story of the flying chariots, but these would have been very ordinary in the latter age of Atlantis. Even in the Edgar Cayce readings, there are references to Rata's use of the flying chariot to visit Atlantis. The present-day young people who are so restlessly seeking for the things of the spirit are all Atlanteans of the latter days, when many of them turned away at that time to the material gods of Belial. This is the karmic reason that their search, in the present, is so desperate. Unconsciously, they realize that as a group they failed once before, and they cannot allow themselves to fail again. The great stress that they put on love is Atlantean, but in the matter of many, many loves, they have not yet found the ideal of one eternal love as expressed in Atlantis and in India. Plato is our first writer who mentions alter egos, twin souls. Almost every child in the Atlantean culture knew that within the universe was another portion of his own entity, another self, a counterpart, or what Edgar Cayce chose to call an answer to self. From the very beginning, this had been true, from the first separation of Amelius. There are legends of Lilith, the projection of Amelius Adam before the separation took place within his own bodily structure, but Lilith has no part in this story, except as representative of many loves. Again, Edgar Cayce predicted that in the New Age, the age of Aquarius, children will be born with an intuitive knowledge of God and of the other portion of the entity. Thus, the modern children of the New Age with their ideal, as presently expressed, of many loves, will be followed by their own children who will, unconsciously, search for the one, eternal love. We cannot know the whole story of Ram. Many Atlanteans began to migrate into other areas in the last age. Just as the destruction of California by earthquake has been prophesied to occur close to the end of this age, the final destruction of Atlantis was predicted by the great mystic leaders of Atlantis thousands of years before it finally occurred. Ram, seemingly, chose India because the inner teachings would be carefully preserved there. As each group of people have a single, outstanding characteristic above all others, these people of the many lands which became India were particularly blessed with visual memory, as well as a dedication of purpose. In reading the Upanishads, pronounced Upanishads, which are the knowledge portion of the Vedas, it is striking how similar they are to the early teachings of the Book of the Dead, in certain respects. Even to the readings as given by Edgar Cayce. The sensualism of India has been attacked again and again by those of the Western world. There was a period in the development of mankind when it was necessary for even religion to embrace physical love, so that man and woman might become, truly, helpmeets in their relationship to each other. Much of the early East Indian literature is misunderstood by the Western world. The Vedas, or those teachings which came to be so called, would have been the Atlantean memory teachings of a time when man was not imprisoned in human flesh. They would also have unfolded the mystical teachings for men of all time. In reading the Vedas, particularly the Upanishads, there is a sense of timelessness, of everlastingness, or of earth becoming heaven, mortality becoming immortality, man becoming, even, a god in his sojourns in the earth and in other dimensions of experience. We can quote from only a few of the Vedas, and these but briefly, but it is well to remember that although there are mystics today in India who have retreated too much into self, so that the starving beggar is not seen by them, it does not change the fact that these are eternal truths. We wish, with all our hearts, to know of the teachings of Amelius in Atlantis, of Ram, who came after him. These are the teachings of Amelius in Atlantis, and of Ram, who came after him. Of the first Krishna, of the second Krishna, even of Zoroaster and Zen. Listen, but for a moment, to the rhythm and beauty of these age-old truths. As brought by Rama into the land of India. Bradaranyaka Upanishad. Edited by Radhakrishnan, George Allen and Unwin. Ruskin House. Museum Street, London. On Dreams and Sleep, 7, which is the self? The person here who consists of knowledge among the senses. The light within the heart. He, remaining the same, wanders along the two worlds seeming to think, seeming to move about. He, who, on becoming asleep transcends this world in the forms of death. Edgar Cayce has given that in a deep state of sleep, we leave the body, journeying to other dimensions. In truth, we are never separated from a beloved one, whether that one is in the body or in the land called death, for in sleep, all dimensions may be entered. The heart has no home, except its creator, and in reality, even reincarnation has no truth, except in the sense of time. For the eternal spirit, male and female in one, stands ever before the living throne of the Father. Earth then is an illusion, and the lives of men within the earth. Only God, the Eternal One, is truth. And we, who, spiritually, are ever a part of Him. Verily, there are just two states of this person, the state of being in this world and the state being in the other world. There is an intermediate state, there are being in sleep, dream. By standing in this intermediate state, one sees both of those states, of being in this world and of being in the other world. Having obtained that way, one sees both the evils of this world and the joys of the other world. When he goes to sleep, he takes along the material of this all-embracing world, himself tears it apart, himself builds it up. He sleeps, dreams, by his own brightness, by his own light. In that state, the person becomes self-illuminated. Again, returning to the readings of Edgar Cayce, we find that before we enter into the body, there may be a general pattern which we have chosen. Certainly, We have an overall soul purpose which continues for all of our lives in the earth. There are moments, however, when the soul becomes exceedingly weary of its karma in the earth, when it loses sight of the brightness of its tomorrows, when it can embrace nothing but the everyday happenings of its life. It is then that it returns, in dreams, to its eternal purpose throughout the ages. Out of the body, we are much as we are in the earth. Our other body seems to be as solid as the one on earth. We look the same, although usually much younger. But we can journey with the quickness of thought to the highest points of consciousness. We can behold ourselves. We can see our journeyings in and our journeyings out. And we know that we are eternal. We know that we are His children, whatever our race, our culture, our creed. We know that life is but for a fleeting moment, but that we are for all time. And we bless the sorrows which have brought us closer to Him. We forgive all in the earth, and we pray like forgiveness from them. His love is poured within us, within the chalice of our hearts, until the cup runneth over. It is then that we return. One more day, and another, and another. For in the dream state, we have beheld His eternal purpose, and we have beheld our own. The state of the dreamless dream, the out-of-the-body experience, is somewhat akin to nirvana. Again, the Westerner believes this is to be a nothingness, and he is repelled by the thought of becoming nothing, but in the Upanishads we find the far deeper meaning. This, the dreamless dream, verily, is his form which is free from craving, free from evils, free from fear. As a man when in the embrace of his beloved wife knows nothing without or within, so the person when in the embrace of the intelligent self, the all-knowing self, knows nothing within or without. That, verily, is his form in which his desire is fulfilled, in which the self-it is his desire, in which he is without desire, free from all sorrow. In this analogy of man and wife in loving embrace, the seer is describing the oneness of the self. Saint John of the Cross spoke of the divine marriage. For the Sufis of India, God is the eternal feminine. Thus, the mystic union of the soul and spirit, the coming together after its sojourn in the earth world, is the eternal union. There is no desire here, because all is within the self. The self is untouched either by good or by evil, and the sorrows of the heart cease to be sorrows, and are turned into joy. The completeness of this state of eternal bliss, the forgiveness of this state, is adequately described in the following. There, in that state, a father is not a father, a mother is not a mother. The worlds are not of the worlds, the gods are not of the gods, the Vedas are not the Vedas. There, a thief is not a thief. A murderer is not a murderer. A mendicant is not a mendicant, an ascetic is not an ascetic. He is not affected by good. He is not followed by evil. For then, there, he has passed beyond all the sorrows of the heart. He has passed beyond the sorrows of the heart. He has become one with the eternal being, as he was before the world was. And all the knowledge of all kingdom is his, but for the taking. And he takes it not. And all the wealth, and all the power, and all the glory. But he takes it not. For his heart has found its home. The story, then, of mankind in the earth and of his eternal purpose, was brought by Ram into the land of India. Legend says that he came with a great host, and with flying chariots of golden hue. Since Ram was the greatest of mystics, he knew, within himself, that the other portion of his entity had chosen to be born in the land which he entered. That even now, she waited for him. Their omission was to be together, to work together. Among those who were native-born, who looked into the skies on that day when Ram entered India, there was one who was, himself, a great seer. This seer was also a king of his province, and his most beloved possession was his daughter, Sita. Janaka had foretold the coming of Ram or Rama from a far country, a country which one day would go into the sea. Janaka had also foretold that the ancient teachings of this great land were to be given to his own people, to be cherished by them for eons, so that the heart of man within the earth must never forget them. Sita, standing beside him, strained her eyes into the bright sky. They came. She knew, for her father had told her, that he would be among them. He would ask for her hand in marriage. He was the other portion of her own entity, her other self, in a different body, but, together, they were one for all eternity. He came, this Ram, from out of the clouds. From the moment of his entry, he was revered as a god. He came, and he found his way even to the palace of the great seer, Janaka, and it was here at the home of Janaka that Ram, the Atlantean, of straight black hair and a reddish tinge to his skin, bent the great bow, making Sita his bride. The bow was the mystical bow of the spirit, and its bending, which could be done by none other, proved their eternal oneness. Again, if we turn to the Ramayana, the Indian story of Rama and Sita, we find that in all ways they were one. This story differs, somewhat, from the Akasha. The tales of the Ramayana speak of the machinations of evil ones who sent Rama and Sita into the forest for a period of more than 12 years. It would seem, however, that after a few years at the great court of Janaka, after a period of bringing a closeness among the many provinces of India, the very spirit of Rama longed for the quietude of the forest. Sita would not let him go alone, and they wandered, as early mendicants, subsisting upon what was given them, and living as supplicants, asking only to know more of the living God. For 12 long years, they knew complete happiness together. Then, one day, the evil king called Ravana beheld Sita, and desired her for his own. After many plans, he came to her, dressed as a mendicant, begging for bread. Rama was in the heart of the forest, deep in meditation. When Sita brought the evil one, Ravana, bread, he caught her and carried her away on his horse. In some of the legends, there is, again, the story of the flying chariot, with which he took her even to his home in Lanka, later called Ceylon. In all ways Sita and Rama had been one, and they knew that in many incarnations they had been as mother and son, father and daughter, husband and wife, sister and brother. Telepathy was so strong between them that Rama came out of his meditation with a great cry. Something had happened to Sita. She had been captured by the evil one. In his agony of spirit, he returned to the home of her father, Janaka. Here, after a period of time, he amassed his flying chariots to wage war on Ravana. He sent a friend, who was a monkey man or disguised as a monkey, to the palace of Ravana, but Hanuman found Sita in an Asoka grove. She had refused to accept any of the entreaties of Ravana to become another wife of his. In all ways, she had remained faithful to her husband, Rama. Because Ravana knew that she was a chosen one within whose heart rested the mysteries of the ages, he was afraid to take her without her consent. Finally, after months, the day arrived and the people of Lanka beheld flying chariots in the air. Ceylon was taken. Rama had taken it in a matter of hours. Verily, the people fell down and worshipped him. Sita believed that he had done all of this for her. He had fought a great battle for her so that she might return with him. Whether to a palace or whether to the forest, it made no difference. She was his forever. Nothing could separate them. They were one soul within the earth. Their spirit was the same. Nothing could come between them, for they had been given, one to the other, in the very beginning. Ram was Amelia's, who separated, and she was his other portion, Amelia. No power on earth, she believed, could ever part them. No power, but one. And it was this power that was to separate them for the remainder of that lifetime, and which was to bring each one to a sorrowful karmic lifetime as Jeshua and Maria. Jeshua, who was to grieve each day of his life because of the plight of his mother, but who was to remain with her all the days of his life. Maria, who was completely innocent as Sita of any wrongdoing, but who in some incarnation must have wielded the heavy gavel of condemnation of one who was without a husband, one who had been refused. When Rama came to the Asoka grove, he found Sita, who rushed to throw herself again in his arms. In the long years in the forest, they had been denied only one thing: a son, children of the flesh. It was just before she was taken away by Ravana that Sita had known that she was pregnant, that she would bear Rama's son. 6 months and intervened. She was no longer the slim girl-like wife that he had known, but she was heavy with child. Pride was a great weakness of the Atlanteans. At the moment he beheld her, Rama feared that he had been deceived, that she had not been a faithful wife, that she carried the child of another within her body. He cried out to her not to touch him. He shouted, "Woman, you think that I have waged this great battle for you? I did it for myself. For the pride of my household. I shall not send you to your death, as is the custom of this country for an unfaithful wife. I shall send you back into the forest where we knew our greatest happiness. Begone from me. I cannot bear to look at you." All the protests of Sita were unavailing. She could not remind him, even, of the great happiness that they had shared in the knowledge that after many moons she was to bear his son. He chose to believe, in pride and rage, that she had carried on a secret affair with Ravana, even in their own forest. Sita was taken again to the forest, and there she lived in the shadow of a hermitage. Her son was born. He grew to manhood. One day, 15 years later, a group of Rama's men rode through these woods and beheld this boy, who was the image of Rama himself. When Rama heard of this, he sent for Sita and their son. And he embraced each of them, asking them to return. The years had been long for Sita. Her beauty had faded with the harshness and loneliness of her years. True, another wife, not of his spirit, had replaced her. Her father, Janaka, was long dead. For days she grieved for all the happiness that could have been. Rama was called the Blessed One in every portion of India as well as Ceylon. He had trained hundreds of teachers who had begun the first of the Vedas. He was a devout man. He was a good man. In all ways, he had served the living God, except in one. He had turned her aside, his faithful wife, because of the pride of his spirit. Suicide is that which must one day be worked out. There have been moments in almost every culture when suicide has been chosen by many people. It is only a putting off until another day of that which must be born. The same problems are given once again to test the soul in another embodiment. Sita knew all of this, but she, too, as with Rama, had great pride of spirit, and she could not bear to think of herself, no longer young, no longer beautiful, as a wife who had once been refused. Sita chose her death, since she had been unable to choose a life as she wished for it to have been. On a day of mourning, when many funeral pyres were to be lit for the dead, she kissed her beloved son for the last time. She then made her way to the great audience hall where Rama wished to see her. She knew his wish. Despite his pride, he would ask her, beg her, if necessary, before all the people, to return to him as his wife. When she came to him, she saw that his eyes showed his tiredness of spirit. He was an extremist. He had believed himself right on that day so many years before. Now, that he knew that he had betrayed her, he would not rest until he could make amends. Before the whole court, he asked her to return to him. He confessed his wrong and asked her forgiveness. Her forgiveness she gave, or so she believed. Had they not been together in the earth since the beginning? Was his soul not a part of her own? And his spirit of her spirit? When once again he asked her, pleading, before all the people, she answered, only, that on that very day she would make her decision. An hour later, she made her way toward the last of the funeral pyres. She was dressed in the soft, clinging garb which the women of India love best, even today. At her throat lay the pendant, the Atlantean Sunday that Rama had given her on her wedding day. She climbed to the highest of the fires. For an instant, only, she closed her eyes. There was yet time. She could yet return to Rama. To her son, who loved her. She could yet return to the mission which she had chosen as her own before entering the body. The mission of bringing enlightenment to her people. It was for an instant she paused. In the sorrow and loneliness of her spirit, the flame of her love for Rama lay quiescent. It was as if all feeling had been wrung from her in the years of her widowhood in the forest, near the hermitage. What would it mean, this suicide? Certainly, great aloneness in another lifetime. Certainly, a similar life pattern to be met again. Now, as a queen in a high place, received once again by her husband, she could answer many needs. If he chose to come again, in a high place, was she erasing the possibility that she would be his helpmeet? His consort? There was no longer any moment for thought. The fires were dying. What must be done must be done. If it were pride which impelled her, as it had Rama in the day of their separation, then she would learn, through many lives, the nothingness of worldly pride. She could not forego it now. She could not bear the glances of the women of the court, even of her father's friends whom she had known since childhood. She took a deep breath. She felt the white-hot flames about her. She could no longer think. The moments before her death were an eternity, but it was over. Finally, it was over. Her father, Janaka, the seer, had died years before, even at the time that Ravana had taken her captive. But here he stood before her, in the strength of his youth. He was no longer old. He was younger, seemingly, than she. In this hour he took her into his arms. She would go to the springs of healing where she would forget all the sorrows of earth, and there, she would plan again for a new life, when she would not fail in her mission. Whatever it cost her. The last thing that Sita saw as she left her body was the Atlantean sun, her wedding gift. It had been thrown clear of the flames. It lay there upon the ground, the only remnant of her life on earth. It was this that the porters found. It was this that they took to Rama, their king. The Atlantean sun, on a chain of pure gold, fashioned by Rama himself, for Sita, the bride of his flesh, the bride of his spirit. This is how Rama learned of her death. The years of his life would yet to be many. He could not undo that which he had done, but there was much that he must yet accomplish. His people, those whom he had chosen in this new land to call his own, were a childlike people, childlike with the grace of God upon their faces. He loved them with an unspeakable love. He had failed the other portion of his spirit. This, he would meet again. But he could not, fail in his mission. Once again, as in the early days of his marriage to Sita, Rama turned with his whole soul to the mysteries. The Vedas were memorized by the priests, but the people must remember the eternal truths in other ways, also. He would inaugurate religious festivals. Festivals of the spirit. They loved to dance, to sing, to chant. They loved the play of many lights in the twilight. All these would be a part of that which they must remember. The first festival was in celebration of the spring, at the time of the ram, which was his own symbol. The Aryan cycle. Because he, himself, was to know aloneness of spirit, the separation from the one who was, in truth, his other self, he wished this first festival to be consecrated to the young. To those who were lovers. To those who had met after many moons. It was dedicated to the bride and the bridegroom. The festival of the spring. After the festival of the spring, there must be another. It would come in summer, and it would be dedicated to the sons and daughters of the land. From the moment of sunrise until the midnight hour, they would gather in song and dance. But the mysteries would not be forgotten. Dressed as priests and priestesses, themselves, they would recite the tenets which had been taught them. Which he had brought them from the Atlantean land. From that which was taught, even in the beginning, by Emilius, when the morning stars sang together. This second festival would be the festival of the summer. Those who had grown old together, who were in the autumn of their lives, these too must not be forgotten. They must remember, within themselves, that life in the earth is but for a moment. That in the hour that age comes upon a man or a woman, this is the hour of blessing. For they have lived through the heat of the youth. They are closer to their eternal soul purpose than ever before. Actually, the autumnal season is a creative time. It was at this time in his own life that Rama returned to the purpose for which he entered their body. During the 15 years of Sita's absence, he had not been free from worldly ambition. It was here, perhaps, that he first created the karmic pattern of Joshua. Rama had entered a land not his own with the highest of soul purposes. When his personal life brought him bitterness and doubt, he turned to the things of the world for a moment. It was during this time that the many provinces of India became allied, with himself as their leader. Atlanteans and trusted natives held the most responsible positions. It was with the finding of Sita's son, who bore his own face, that Rama turned, again, to establishing those precepts which he had brought from the Atlantean land. During the second and third age of Atlantis, a great cruelty was inflicted upon certain of the people. The story of Atlantis would take a huge volume in order just to scratch the surface. Before Amelia separated, before the great influx of souls which entered into Atlantis, there had been Lemuria. Here, again, automatons were created. Here, every type of projection from the self took form. Among these were animal-like projections used as pets. It is not too far-fetched to believe that even today, certain pets which are close to us may have been created by ourselves centuries before. There were also creatures in Atlantis, a carryover from this early Lemurian period, which Edgar Cayce chose to call things. Hanuman, the ape-like man, whom Rama sent to the Asoka garden where Sita chose to stay, was such a creature, perhaps, brought into India by the Atlanteans. In Atlantis, vivisection was used as never before until this present age. There are reasons to believe that this was one of the deciding factors in the downfall of Atlantis. The creatures or things were used as slaves or to be vivisected, torn apart while yet alive for experimental purposes. As great as any other of his missions in India, and in this Rama did not fail, he brought to these people the knowledge that the animals, too, are a part of the eternal kingdom. They are God's creatures. They are evolving. No man has a right to inflict needless suffering or hurt upon them. In India, there is a deep respect for all life. Valmiki's heart was torn by the sight of the wounded dove and by her mate's anguish. But no place else in the world is the right of a lesser creature so observed as in India, and this was introduced by Rama, who turned away from Atlantis, in part, because of the cruelties that the Atlanteans were inflicting upon the creatures and upon the animals. It was necessary for the Atlanteans to destroy dinosaurs and mastodons for their very safety. The most evolved Atlanteans had a great closeness with most of the animal kingdom. It is a part of spiritual evolution that all men are brothers to the advanced soul, and the little ones of the animal world, also. In bringing the ancient teachings of Atlantis to India, his own teachings as Amilius, Rama placed them in the heart of these people for all time to come. For the initiate of every age, these truths would be found within his own heart. But for those who would not yet remember, they were memorized by the priests and handed down generation after generation. The final and most sacred of all the festivals is the one which corresponds to our Yule-tide, but known, then, as the Festival of the Winter. Of this, Edouard Schur, the French writer, has given the festival of seed sowing. This, Ram consecrated to the newborn children, to the offspring of love conceived in springtime, and to the souls of the dead. A union of the visible with the invisible, this religious solemnity formed at once the farewell to souls that had departed, and mystic salvation to those which returned to be incarnated in mothers, and born again in children. On that holy night, the Aryans of old, Ram was Atlantean, from the Isle of Aryan, met in the sanctuaries of the Aryanavia. With torch and song they celebrated the return of the terrestrial and solar year, the germination of nature and the depth of winter, the thrill of life in the midst of death, and the triumphant birth of the new sun from the mighty Night Mother. In linking the sacred festivals to the changing seasons and to the constellations in the heavens, Zoroaster was to follow closely that which Rama had instigated long before him. Such was the admiration of Zoroaster for Rama that he chose to call him the chief of all nations, the Blessed Monarch. In all the ancient books in which Rama is mentioned, there is evidence of his great love for his people, and it was thus that he was remembered as a great master of India and spiritual king of the earth. Rama came in the flying chariot of the Atlanteans with a host of followers. The people believed that a god had come down into their earth. They were never to change this belief, because he gave them of the eternal truths. He gave these into their keeping, forever. It will be asked by those of the Western world that if Rama brought the one god of the Atlanteans, why did other gods emerge out of these early teachings? Rama brought the one god. But the one god of the Atlanteans, as taught by Amilius and Amelia, was the eternal masculine-feminine principle. Amilius, first androgynous, then embodying in separate bodies the male and female polarity, is represented not only of the twin soul, but the other portion of the entity, but of the eternal Christ principle. Other gods grew up, long after his demise, but these foster children of his were aware of past embodiments, so that many of the gods by various names were embodiments, rather than separate personalities. Krishna of the Bhagavad-Gita was the last incarnation of the Christ in India, but before that, after Amilius, there was Rama. When the Vedas were forgotten, the first Krishna chose to be born into India to bring them out of the depths of memory. And then came, finally, Krishna of the Bhagavad-Gita. It was Krishna himself who remembered Rama and who knew, despite great soul suffering in the earth, that Rama accomplished that which he set out to do. To bring the mysteries of the Atlanteans to the people of India. And so it was done. The second Krishna, the beloved one, was to become a symbol of the people themselves. Krishna was believed to have been born in a royal household, the son of Devaki, sister of the king, Kamsa. Kamsa, a paranoid personality, had had strange dreams that a greater one than he would be his sister's son. He had given orders that the son be slain at the moment of his birth. Krishna's birth occurred early, however, and Devaki's devoted maidservant substituted a baby girl in his stead. A child of a cow herdsman. Krishna became the son of a humble herdsman. According to the Akashic records, much of this story is true. Had Krishna been allowed to remain in the court, he would have been far less beloved of his people. There was no longer an Atlantis. It had sunk, long ago, into the sea. As Ram, he had entered India to bring the sacred truths to these people for all time. As the second Krishna, he was to complete that which he had begun as Ram. In the streets of India, today, even in the marketplaces, if you listen, you can hear the name Krishna spoken again and again. His name is upon their lips, because it has been engraven within their hearts for centuries. Except for Jesus of Nazareth, no one else, in all the earth, has been so greatly beloved. Of all the gods of India, which grew up long after the entry of Ram, Krishna, alone, is the most symbolic of his people. In youth, he laughed and danced and loved. In early middle age, he became completely the mystic. There are hundreds of folk tales about Krishna. Many of them relate to boyhood pranks. As with the Atlanteans, he is said to have had magical powers. Obviously, legends grow up about many world teachers, but because Krishna was so much revered, his feats appear to be so many that it would take 100 books in which to chronicle them all. Strangely enough, this was somewhat of the problem of the early church fathers. There were many books relating to Jesus, and there was difficulty in choosing those testaments most representative of him. Other books were put completely aside, such as the Book of Enoch, which has been discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and which, along with Isaiah, would seem to have been the most beloved book of the Essenes. As with Krishna, there were stories of the early life of Jesus, which related even to magic in the books put aside by the early church fathers. One such story, very similar to a story about Krishna, relates to an afternoon when the master tailor of a shop lay sleeping. Jesus, whose real name was Jeshua, and by this he was always known, entered the shop and in a spirit of boyish merriment, he is said to have cut up a bolt of beautiful silk. When the shopkeeper awoke and saw his prized treasure in shreds, he began to scream, hysterically. In an instant, Jesus restored the precious cloth to its original form, and its length seemed even greater than before. Mary, herself, was at the wedding when the wine was exhausted, and the host had nothing else to serve his guests. It was she who remembered that in one of their journeys, Jesus had turned the very rocks into bread. It was she who asked him to perform the miracle of turning water into wine. Once Krishna stole the clothes of a group of young shepherdesses, replacing them with much more beautiful ones. Often he played the flute so that they followed him wherever he went. The East Indian poems telling of the young Krishna are beautiful in their love imagery. Legend depicts him as one who loved all people. There was a radiance to his personality which captured not only the heart of the shepherdesses, but the heart of the sages who taught him in youth. Most of the poetry, as well as the paintings, regarding him were begun centuries after his lifetime. Of Krishna's romance with Radha, who was supposed to have been Sita, and the eternal feminine principle with him throughout the ages, Sahant Singh has written. Here is love's enchanted zone, here time and the firmament stand still. Here the bride and bridegroom never can grow old. Here the fountains never cease to play and the night is ever young. From Loves of Krishna, W. G. Archer, Macmillan Company. In a poetic painting illustrating this poem, Krishna and Radha are portrayed drifting on a lake in a boat of scarlet. And again they are shown together in a great pavilion of marble. Again, we have the theme of eternal love. where time stands still and the bride and bridegroom never grow old. Their love lasts through incarnation after incarnation. The boy, Krishna, the musician and the dancer is described by Sir Das. Krishna is dancing in the medley of moods and poses. His crown sways, his eye grows move, the swing of his waist makes his girdle sing, and the anklets jingle. One fancies one is listening to the sweet voice of a pair of geese as they touch each other in dalliance. With Krishna in the midst, the cowherds come to their homes. The calves and cows are ahead, frisking and playing as they go. All the pipes and horns go forth, each his own notes playing. The sound of his flute moves the cows to low as there is a cloud of dust. The crown of peacock's feathers glistened on the head like a young moon. The cowherd boys frolic on the path, and Krishna in the center sings his song. Ravished by the sight, the cowgirls pour out their minds and spirits, gazing on Krishna, quenching their heart's desire. From Loves of Krishna, W.G. Archer, Macmillan Company. In one of the god forms of Krishna, he is given 4 hands, so that he might hold the hands of the many who love him, and who were enchanted by his flute in the days of his boyhood. The great poems and paintings depict Krishna, after many loves, becoming one with Radha, love beloved through eternity, where time and earth stand still. The Bhagavad-Gita is considered by scholars to be one of the greatest classics of all the religious literature. This poem is a small portion of the Mahabharata, which was compassed over a period of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of years. The Bhagavad-Gita is presumed to be a dialogue between Prince Arjuna and Krishna. There are 2 interpretations of the Gita. One of them is that this book relates, actually, to the circumstances surrounding a battle between kingsmen. Arjuna, a young warrior prince, has been drawn into this battle against his own people. He turns to Krishna to give him the answers which he most needs, and finally, he joins in this war. Mahatma Gandhi chose to believe that this great epic related not to a physical battle, but the eternal war within the soul, which finds itself embodied in a physical vehicle. As with the teachings of Zoroaster, it related to the spirit within man, whether he should follow the spirit of light within himself, or the spirit of darkness. Arjuna would seem to be a symbol for all men, and Krishna would be representative of the Christ consciousness in the earth, the universal soul of which we are also integrally a part. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is so much of the teachings of Zoroaster, and there is much of the mysticism of the East, even something of the very teachings embodied by Krishna. This would be, perhaps, because Melchizedek, who was without father without mother, as a former incarnation of Jesus, was the greatest mystic of all time, except for the Christ. It was he who began the schools of the inner teachings, such as the Essenian schools. The Hermetic teachings, also, embrace the mysteries of Melchizedek. In Hebrews 7.12, Melchizedek is called King of Righteousness, which is King of Peace. Indubitably, the Essenes were aware of reincarnation. They were also aware of the past embodiments of the one who would come as Jesus. Their great love for Deutero Isaiah, which should have been called Jeshua Isaiah, was because they knew that he had written it. The same was true of the Book of Enoch, which with the teachings of Hermes, provided the answers to the seekers of truth for generations. As with the teachings of Zoroaster and Zen, as with Krishna, Enoch was to write. And now I will call forth the spirits of the good who belong to the generation of light, and I will transform those who were born in darkness. And I will bring forth clad in shining light those who have loved my holy name. In 2 Enoch 30.15, we find, and I gave him, Adam, his free will, and I showed him the 2 roads, the road of light and the road of darkness, and I said to him, this one is good and that one is evil. Zen and Zoroaster, Enoch, as well as Krishna, bring forth a duality in consciousness. Moses did this also when, in Deuteronomy 30, he wrote, choose you this day whom you will serve. Thus, the battle with Arjuna, the bowman, and Krishna, as the charioteer, is the eternal battle within ourselves. Mahatma Gandhi found his greatest solace in the Bhagavad Gita, because it was his battle, also, and one which he fought all of his life. The beautiful mysticism of the Gita contains, within itself, eternal truths for all mankind. In seeking to comfort Arjuna that there can be no actual death, Krishna speaks. He who shall say, Lo, I have slain a man. He who shall think, Lo, I am slain. Those both know not. Life cannot slay. Life is not slain. And, as in the words of my dream, never the spirit was born. The spirit shall cease to be, never. Never was time, it was not. End and beginning are dreams. Birthless and deathless and changeless remaineth the spirit, forever. Death have not touched it at all, dead though the house of it seems. Song Celestial, Sir Edwin Arnold, perhaps the new translation of the Bhagavad-Gita by Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda, expresses the eternality of spirit even more strongly. How can it die, in the death of the body? Knowing it birthless, knowing it deathless, knowing it endless, forever unchanging. Worn-out garments are shed by the body. Worn-out bodies are shed by the dweller within the body. Of the old soul, who returns to earth again and again that he might help his fellow man, Krishna speaks. Who burns with the bliss, and suffers the sorrow of every creature within his own heart, making his own each bliss and each sorrow, him I hold highest. Song of God, Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda, and of himself, the avatar of this planet. In every age I come back to deliver the holy, to destroy the sin of the sinner, to establish righteousness. Song of God, Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda. On adoration of the Christ Spirit. Give me a whole heart. Love and adore me. Worship me always. Bow to me only, and you will find me. This is my promise, who love you dearly. As Jesus gave. Matthew 11:28. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Krishna, in the same spirit, spoke. Lay down all duties. In me, your refuge. Fear no longer, for I will save you from sin and bondage. In order to know him. To love is to know me, my innermost nature. The truth that I am. Through this knowledge, he, the seeker, enters at once to my being. Of the destiny of mankind. All mankind is born for perfection, and each shall attain it, will he but follow his nature's duty. Of the man who seeks God with all his heart. A man who is born with tendencies toward the divine is fearless and pure in heart. He perseveres in that path to union with Brahman, the Godhead, which the scriptures and his teacher have taught him. He can't control his passions. He practices spiritual disciplines. He is straightforward, truthful, and of an even temper. He harms no one. He renounces the things of this world. He has a tranquil mind and an unmalicious tongue. He is so compassionate toward all. He is not greedy. He is gentle and modest. He abstains from useless activity. He has faith in a strength of his higher nature. He can forgive and endure. He is clean in thought and act. He is free from hatred and from pride. The birthright of the divine nature leads to liberation. The birthright of demonic nature leads to greater bondage. Hell has 3 doors: lust, rage, and greed. These lead to man's ruin. He who passes by these 3 dark doors has achieved his own salvation. He will reach the highest goal at last. The light that lives in the sun lighting all the world, the light of the moon, the light that is in fire. Know that light to be mine. I am in all hearts. I give and take away knowledge in memory. I am the teacher, the knower of the Vedanta. For I am Brahman, the Godhead, within this body. Life immortal, that shall not perish. I am the truth, and the joy, forever. From the Song of God, Bhagavad-Gita, Swami Prabhavananda, Christopher Isherwood translation, a Mentor Classic. These would seem to be the words of the Christ Spirit, whether speaking in India thousands of years ago to his people, or to another people, in Judea. As Jesus gave. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. The life of Krishna, of the Bhagavad-Gita, was, surely, another mansion of his spirit.